I'd like to take just a moment to introduce our panelists. If you guys can all just introduce yourself and give us high-level 30-second rundown of your roles and what you're doing.
Sure.
We'll start with
me.
John. There you
Hi,
go.
everyone. Good morning. I'm John Ha. I lead the workplace environments team at Stripe. So I've been at Stripe 6 years. Essentially, the workplace environments team is responsible for, leasing, site selection, the design and build out of all of our spaces. So yeah, it's been really fun, kind of navigating the last few years in that role.
Hi everyone, I'm Q. I'm the Chief People and Communications Officer at Paper, which is an education technology company, and I've been there for about almost 7 months. Prior to that, I was at Airbnb for 5 years, where I ran people operations, workplace facilities, and a few other kind of people functions in between.
And hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Escobar. I'm the Global Head of Real Estate and Workplace for Riot Games. Been there for about a year and a half. Prior to that, I was at Netflix, Honey, and Hulu. And I was with Hulu for 12 years. So it was a big run.
So I just want to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit. I think the goal here is to have an open conversation around kind of the HR workplace, the gap in between, the overlapping of some of the work that we do, and if we can all take away a couple of nuggets of good information back to our respective workplaces, that's kind of the goal. So obviously, culture is a big word, possibly overused, right? But we also know that creating a culture that identifies with the brand is something that we all do, and it's important. We also know that if a company has great culture, it could lead to better productivity, et cetera. And if you have a toxic culture, people generally, it leads to a draining of talent and a draining of energy, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, I was researching a little bit, and I pulled up some stats from a Gallup survey, and I wanted to get a little bit of a read on what people felt about this essentially. So the one thing that I saw, which is I think important to highlight, is that 79% of U.S. workers say that culture is an important job satisfaction factor. And I think that's pretty high. I think we can generally agree on that. On the other hand, with a show of hands, I'd like to ask you guys, there's 34% of U.S. employees are engaged at work. That's a very kind of a scary number, I think. Engagement at work is critical, right? And I think part of our jobs essentially is to kind of boost that engagement and create that positive culture. Do you guys here think, with a show of hands, that that's an accurate stat? Who thinks that 34% of US workers are not satisfied at work?
It seems low.
Yeah.
It seems low?
It seems low.
No, it's just this is Gallup survey. This is not my numbers, but I think it's an interesting point. I think the other thing that I saw that was interesting was 67% of employees that have access to free food are very happy with their job. With a show of hands, I thought that was a little bit sad. But this is the one that I think is actually really important in from my perspective, and it seems a little bit cheesy, but with the show of hands, I'd like to ask you guys, 50%. Sorry, if you have work friendships or work relationships that are valuable, that can boost your employee satisfaction by 50%. How many people feel like that's? I see a strong hand in the back. Okay, that seems. So I think and this is kind of a good segue into kind of what we want to talk about. We all value those human connections. We all think that having those connections at work are important to satisfaction in the workplace, right? And we all know that the role of HR has evolved from just being this compliance-oriented role, hiring, firing role, to really people and culture. And that's kind of where workplace and HR overlap. So I think what's important. I'd love to know from you guys. Number one, we'll start with you, John. Where do you report into?
Yeah, so this has been a kind of a journey. I was currently, as of 2 months ago, reported into the CFO org, which I think is pretty standard for a workplace real estate organization. But over my 6 years at Stripe, first started as reporting to the COO, then briefly to CFO, then the people org for a couple of years, and now back to CFO. So it's been a little bit of a journey, ping-ponging back and forth. And I think there's been pros and cons, obviously, to each of those. I think depending on where Stripe was in its trajectory. I mean, I started when I started at Stripe, we were a little under 700 people, and in my in 4 years we were over 10x that. So you know, as teams kind of develop, and when we first started, the COO made a lot of sense. Our head of workplace was really intentionally aligned under the COO so we could move quickly. We were hiring a ton of people. It was a 1-to-1 desk ratio, so it was sort of like we need butts and seats. We need to move quickly. So that was a quick way to kind of get approvals on things and really be aligned with the strategy for the company as we were growing. Obviously, as we became sort of a massive cost center for the company, the alignment with the CFO org made a lot of sense. I think initially it was a little bit more of a focus on like what's your bottom line, what can you cut. So it was actually a really nice transition to then go to the people org. And I think honestly, there's no one from Stripe watching, hopefully, but I think that's actually the best alignment that we've had so far.
Is being
In the people org. So like
org.
the people in places team is what we were, and I think so much of to your point, the HR, the policies, the sort of the hiring, the programs, the benefits component of that being really closely tied to your physical workspace, and just making sure that those are in alignment is really important for employee experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's so much of what our focus is now. It's not about utilization or hitting certain, number of people coming in on every day. It's so much more about like fostering connectivity, driving employee experience. Those are kind of our main goals and KPIs, right? So,
right. And it's interesting that it's flipped from you guys have kind of been shuffled around, which highlights this this nomadic.
Yeah.
Where do we belong in the workplace? How about you, Sarah?
I mean, I think let's be honest. There's most organizations have struggled with where workplace fits,
Yeah.
and our roles have changed dramatically in the last 3 years or so. I was very fortunate that when I was at Hulu, I was placed under the chief people officer, and we really saw workplace as one of the elements that serves the employee experience. So anything that served the employee experience was under the chief people officer. When I went to Honey, I was with the COO. When I went to Netflix, I was with the CFO. I'm now back with the COO. But it starting off with the chief people officer really framed for me that I am going to join people first companies. And that's the type of company that I want to be with. So for me, it doesn't matter where I report as long as the company is a people first company and what I do is seen as something that impacts people's work.
Yeah, and for me, it's at Paper, we're remote first, so we don't really have a lot of offices. So it's under the COO because our offices are mostly just for offsites because the employee base is distributed across the country. At Airbnb, which I thought worked pretty well from the inside perspective, was workplace was always under the people team. So the people team, in its unique way at Airbnb, always had internal communications, workplace, and the core people team, for lack of better words, all working as one kind of trifecta to drive employee experience. So I thought, but to everyone's point, I think no matter where it sits, you have to just have a unified want to amplify the employee experience, and that can come across with strong leadership. If you have a strong CEO or the executive team that's looking at it from one lens of employee experience, that could come across no matter where you sit. But sometimes it can index one way or the other if you're on the CFO lens and they're looking at it from a cost lens, for example, because that's their domain. That's what they are doing. So it really depends, and it bounces all over.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's I'm sure people here can identify with that. Some probably report to to HR, up to HR, and some report to workplace and have more, or to real estate and have more scrutiny on on the finance side, essentially. So, but that's actually a great segue into another question that we had, which is, so you guys are remote first, whatever the policies might be around hybrid, et cetera, et cetera. With the focus that we have on building that culture, maintaining that culture, how do we maintain that culture while people working remotely, either fully remote, or or not coming in the office. Maybe they're coming in, you know, maybe they're coming in twice a month. But how do we maintain that glue essentially, right? It was like what I was like the analogy is like how do we recharge that Tesla car remotely, right? How do we plug in when they're completely distributed?
Yeah, I can start. So since Paper's, completely remote first, and we were born in the pandemic, so we were born with employees across the country. So either we opened offices in every city, which is not possible, or we figured out a way to kind of intentionally drive that connection. I think for whichever way you look at it, I think it's really you need to have a very strong operating system on how you're connecting with people. And what I mean by that is having a strong communication strategy, right, and executing on it. So it could be as simple as having all company meetings, depending on your size, or not, every single week, or having virtual events, and then to your point, kind of like to the analogy of charging the Tesla car, you can drive it without charging, but eventually you got to charge it, and then you get recharged, and then you go kind of back into your ways of working. In that analogy, I think remote work is great, and I'm a big advocate for it, but you do need those in-person moments of connection to recharge your barometer. So you can then, you can be very productive over Zoom. We've all seen it. We've all been forced into a remote experiment through the pandemic if you were not on that wagon. But in order to deepen and strengthen those relationships, in person is the way to do it, which is why we're all here as well, right? In this environment. So I think you have to be really intentional in regards to the workplace. So Paper is a good example. We're remote first. We do have two offices, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And what we've tried to infuse is whenever teams are doing offsites, they do it at our offices. And we've intentionally curated our offices to instill the culture that we want to project. So what I mean by that is we're in the education technology space. So just an example is in our office in Vegas, one full wall is elementary school kids that came in and drew different murals on it. Right, so like we have our conference rooms are named after principal's office and school vibes. So again, it's really what you want to drive. How can you enable connection through your workplace, be it in a remote first setting and you use it occasionally, or be it you have offices and people may come in on a regular basis on whatever distribution percentage works for your organization. But you have to be very intentional because those water cooler chats are not there. So how do you bring those to light? And you could do those virtually and in person, but you need that operating system to really enable that through time.
Someone recently referred to it on a panel that I was on at a different conference. Yeah,
Not to be named.
not to be named. They referred to it as the hardware and the software. And I loved that analogy because it's, if you have the hardware without the software to actually run it in the operating system,
Yeah.
it's just
love it.
a piece of hardware, right? And so I think your software is your culture. It is getting work done virtually or in person. It is attracting and retaining the right talent. All these phrases that we use all the time. But I love that analogy of the hardware and the software.
Yeah. I mean, well, Stripe's not a remote first company, but we have a significant portion of our employee groups that are fully remote, right? That at least they were hired that way, and then we all were during the pandemic. But as we're coming back to the office more often, I think there's been a real push for people to come together, even if you're remote or office assigned, whatever you're hired for, to come in and actually spend time together. So we have quarterly on-sites. We have a lot of in real life events, but every Friday there's a Friday fireside with Q&A with the founders, and we bring users users of Stripe on to kind of field questions and talk about their experience with our products. And so I think there's like trying to find these touch points for people along the way, right, that bring you in contact with your culture, I guess, your brand.
And I think the thing we've all leaned into here is getting specific about it.
Yeah.
If you're just saying you need to be on site for connection or you need to be on site to understand the culture, that means nothing to people. Having them really understand, like, here is why we promote the culture better on site than we do virtually. For things like you were just saying, the drawings from students and things like that. We have player art within our lobby of our office, and we decorate our offices as if they are the world within League of Legends and things like that. So it really feels immersive. But those are moments of the culture that I think build you up and then you can operate culturally
So
appropriately.
I think this is, I want to drill down on this for a minute for a reason. So let's go back to Tesla. And by the way, they're not a sponsor of this panel, just to make it clear. Um, we can be productive remotely. We all know that. We can get our work done. We all know that, right? But at the same time, leadership wants you to recharge your car. You may think, I can run on empty and I'm totally fine, right? And this is where the controversial, I don't like the word mandate, and I don't want to dive into a mandate conversation, but I think going kind of with the same theme of Tesla, if we want to build culture, if we want to build that community, which impacts bottom line and productivity, right, by fostering those connections, there is like, hey, you're on empty and I'd love you in the office so that we can recharge you. Hey, you're giving me a mandate, you're telling me what to do. So I think there's kind of like, what's the balance between so let's not call it a mandate, let's call it like setting a certain standard and expectation, right? What's that expectation? And the expectation is because we want to put a value on that connection. We want to make sure you're recharged, not just that you're producing, because you can produce, right? How do we balance that, Sarah? Anyone?
Okay,
All of you
I'll go
at
first. So
once.
I think that
Sure.
there's, as we've gone through the pandemic, we've realized, yes, we can absolutely do our work at home and be productive. What many people have forgotten that are at home doing their work is that part of work is also building and maintaining the culture of the company that you operate within, as well as attracting and retaining talent. I think there's three things that actually go into work: getting the work done, attracting and retaining talent, and building the culture. And so what we've found is that we've had to get specific about building relationships is work. And I think that's been one of the biggest messages that we've had to get out there is building relationships is work. And so it doesn't mean you always have to be here, but it does mean that we want to be specific about those rituals that help us to build relationships. And that's actually what we're calling them internally as rituals.
Hmm.
And leaders are setting those rituals that of times that you should be on site in order to help build that culture that we want to have within the
I
team.
think that's an interesting point, actually,
Yeah.
kind of, which I know we're going to touch on communication a little bit, and, which is important as well, but kind of like making that actually part of the job description. Your
Mhm.
job is to do X, Y, and Z. You're an engineer, and 20% of your job is to have in-person collaboration
Yeah.
so that you can build, company culture. And I think that's part of, and that is a good segue into where communication kind of sits into these roles of workplace, HR, and how are we communicating that message?
Hmm.
Is that a unified message? And I'd love to hear from John
Sure.
Hugh on that.
Well, I think the message, well, there needs to be intentionality behind it, right? And for us, I think that this was sort of missing as we were reopening our offices a bit. There was a hesitancy from senior leadership to really communicate sort of the why behind, the need for folks to come back in the office and spend time together. And that we don't have a mandate; it's still a fully flex policy, but at some point, the connectivity, our scores on we have a Stripe satisfaction survey that we do twice a year, and we have these pulse surveys throughout the pandemic. We're just checking on sort of how are you feeling as a person, how connected are you to your team, to our mission, and those were not surprisingly not doing so well, right? And so I think there was a very clear communication from our founders saying, look, we have a hunch that if you come in and spend more time with your team, spend time with just each other in a physical space, it's going to be good for you. And we're not hard mandating it, but we are starting to set up things like connectivity weeks and trying to be intentional with events where you're trying to get people to come on site to do that. But the communication piece of it, I think, is absolutely critical, or else people are just going to think that you're trying to drive utilization. I think we were talking about this in one of the working sessions yesterday, where it was like, is it all about your lease that you have 10 more years on, right? And no, it should be about getting people.
If you report to finance, then
Well,
Maybe.
yeah, exactly. Our CFO might have a different opinion on that, but yeah, I mean, so of course we want people to use this thing that we're paying for, but that it should be really clear that that's not the reason why you're asking people to do this thing.
Yeah.
Right.
I think on communication, two things I would double down on. One is leadership accountability and alignment. What I mean by that is on the accountability front, to your point that you just mentioned, the founders, the executive team, the CEO, they need to get up there and own why they want people to come in. And the reasons could be different. It could be, if you're a 30-person startup and everyone loves coming in and that's how you collaborate, own that. That's okay. Like, own what you want and do it. And the second piece, when I refer to alignment, is having the leadership team even disagree and commit if they need to on what the philosophy is. Because where this breaks is half the executive team wants to do it one way or doesn't like what they're doing, and they're going to let their teams do something else. So really, that accountability and alignment from the top is what I would say is one big thing on communications. It's not what it's not what I go and tell the company as a chief people officer. If the CEO, the founder is not going to own it, it doesn't matter what I say. And that's what I try to coach my founders on. The second one is more on the communication strategy. It has to be unified because it's part of the employee value proposition now, right? It's part of, like, when you're doing any people program, how is it impacting? How is it, because what happened was, at one point in my career, it was when Workplace was separate, they were doing separate surveys, they were doing separate communications, sometimes coming in the same week, sometimes coming in different week. The pandemic and the last few years has evolved Workplace into a lot more than just a facility. It's enabling the experience, enabling the culture to actually propagate. So having a unified communication strategy, no matter where internal comms, like, it sits with me now, but it could sit, it's a little bit like Workplace. It goes through different teams. It's in marketing in some organizations. It's in people. No matter where it is, having that unification of how you're communicating the why and the how, and in alignment with why. The why is the employee value proposition as well. I think that really goes a long way.
Sarah Anderson is ringing in my head right now with her team agreements and making those very clear.
How about with you guys, Sarah? Where does communication sit, and do you feel like there's this, not a tug of war, but do you feel like the messaging is cohesive?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a challenge forever, right? Making messaging cohesive. And there are some companies that say we don't want to over communicate. There are some that say we don't want to under communicate. But I just think that we're dealing with a new level of complexity now, where you have some people working physically, some people working virtually. You have all these, experiential kind of things that are going on that I think you do have to put together cohesive communication plans now. And it's not as easy just to be like, oh, you didn't hear that thing when we were walking down the hallway? And it's much harder. And we have managers and leaders who grew up learning things in hallway conversation and don't necessarily know how to distribute messages cohesively yet. And so I think that we need to communicate significantly more now.
Yeah.
I'll just
More
add
is
one
better.
more point that I
Yeah.
just thought of when you mentioned that is, it's not just internal communications today, it's
Yeah.
external as well.
Yeah.
If you put something out internally, expect that it's going to hit the streets. And if you are trying to tell your customers you are someone else because of a product you may be selling, or because of who your brand is externally, and then you tell your organization something internally, it'll bite you pretty quick. So communications, also the unification and the cohesiveness, is through your brand and external messaging as well, because you can fall flat pretty quick on that. And I think we've seen a lot of examples of that.
True. I, I would just want to add one other sort of angle here. I feel like on the comms front, this may be not as obvious, but I feel like we are much more almost like event promoters these days,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
So on top of just having a unified message, and this is why we want to do these things, right? Like, if you're trying to promote people to come on site for an event or an on-site or whatever, right? It takes a lot of channels to get people to do that, right? And so I think that's been a big sort of component with us and our internal comms team, is like, how can we actually promote these things, whether that's through Slack or emails or blasts on our Friday firesides. So that, like, being really intentional. If you don't do it, people won't show up, right? So I think that's been a big thing.
And it also just goes, like, we were talking a little bit about that, how the role of Workplace has evolved, and we've had to grow to wear so many different hats. We've had to become like, therapists on some level, really understand empathy and the human experience and the evolution of through the entire pandemic. And which is interesting. It's like, what kind of skill set, if we were hiring people for this role today, right?
God.
What kind of skills would you recommend are needed for someone in this kind of role, considering that there's all these different channels essentially that we've kind of grown into? Sarah, how about you?
I constantly tell my team, you end up in Workplace because you're a Jack or Jill of all trades. You don't go to
Does that mean
school.
you're a master of none? Or?
I mean, you have to master a couple of them, but then you
Okay.
have to know how to fill your gaps with people that are masters of others, right?
Right, right.
But you don't go to school for workplace. You don't go get your master's degree in workplace, and so you really have to choose what are those areas that you're going to be a master of, and what are those areas you're going to have people fill the gaps. It's funny. I went and got my master's at Pepperdine University in organization development, and that's very traditionally an HR master's degree. And there were 5 of us throughout the entire 30 years of the program that had ever applied it to workplace. And now that's the expectation,
Right.
is that we're able to change manage, we're able to manage buildings, we're able to be empathetic, and that was never the expectation before. And so I think that you figure out the area you lean into in
Right.
workplace, but
Right.
you have to be a Jack or Jill of all trades.
So just to change gears, sorry, anyone have any? I didn't mean to cut anyone off.
No, no.
Okay. So we've seen the great resignation, we've seen the great reshuffle over COVID, right? What we're hoping to see is the great rehire. Um, how how do you see our roles as workplace leaders kind of contributing, supporting this great rehire initiative?
I can go. Oh, good.
No.
I think on the rehire front, we have kind of the ability to not only attract and retain talent or attract talent in the rehire context, on geographically supporting them based on where they want to be. And from a workplace standpoint, that could mean offices you have, that could mean partnering with space aggregators, whatever the solution is. But how do you actually help the talent like know that you do care about in-person connection even if you're remote, and then somewhere in that spectrum of flexibility, without a mandate or with a mandate if that's what floats your boat, to make sure that you can support them, because you will attract talent based on what you stand for and what they want. Just because I don't like mandating being in the office every week doesn't mean everyone hates it. I'm sure there are people that love going into the office, and they will eventually gravitate to the type of flexibility that they like. So I think we have that, in terms of bringing that to fruition. I think workplaces.
I do find it amazing. Excuse me. I do find it amazing how it used to be that you wanted to work for a company because of what they did, what the job was. And now it's like the first thing we're looking at is, do they want me to come in? How often? Where can
Yep.
I work? Where's the office? What are the amenities?
Flexibility is like
What are
the
the
biggest part of the
right?
employee value proposition.
Which is why I think this is so important,
Yeah.
right? How we're communicating, what are we doing from a workplace / HR comms
Yep.
perspective to put this on top of, to put that out there.
Yeah.
John, what are you guys saying?
Well,
this
so
front?
for us, when I first started, we had a really rigorous 2-week onboarding program in person. It was kind of crazy. I think probably maybe over the top, but it was a really great opportunity to get to learn the business inside and out, right? And really drink the Kool-Aid. And obviously having transitioned that to be fully virtual for the last couple of years, I think the new hires have had a very different experience. And I think in recognizing that, even just in the last month, we've started bringing new hire classes on board in person again. So regardless of if you're remote or office assigned or wherever you are in the world, we're bringing you into one of our hub offices. The education team does in-person onboarding. You get to eat the food, literally, drink the Kool-Aid, I guess. But
You
just
serve Kool-Aid?
spend time. No Kool-Aid. The Collison brothers are a little bit too intense on healthy stuff. There's no burgers or soft drinks. But yeah, but just I think it's a recognition of the fact that like people, especially when you're like formative moments when you first join a company, it's just so much more impactful to do those things in person, right? And to get FaceTime with the founders, or to at Stripe too, like our food team's a big part of the culture, and just interacting with the various people that kind of make up that company culture, right? That you don't get via Zoom, right?
And you mentioned at the beginning making a friend at
Yeah.
work, right? It's so
Yep.
important to have a friend at work, and it is harder to build friendships over video conference.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to be telling people my life story over video conference. That's just not. It doesn't feel natural. So having that opportunity in person is really valuable.
How do you guys do that? Being a remote first company, is the onboarding process as part of that? Is there an in-person intentional experience around
So we try to, within the first 90 days, to make sure a new hire comes into one of our offices, either our HQ office where the founders are, or we make sure, for example, do team offsites. So we do make sure it's not at paper, because we're a lot smaller. It's not the first week, in terms of, like at Airbnb, it was your first week, no matter where you were, you spent kind of similar to your context. But I think the key here is, even for new hires, making sure. So, for example, when I started at Paper 7 months ago, for the first 3 months, I was traveling every other week, and I didn't have to, but I wanted to. I wanted to go meet the teams. If they were not in an office, I was meeting the teams. I was meeting customer-facing teams. I was meeting our teachers, our tutors, who are our customers, not even our own employees. So I think you have to help people facilitate that, especially new hires, because they may not know who to meet, what the cadence is. So I think we just make sure that we make it very clear that in person is critical, and we not only would double down on that for new hires, but also for ongoing. So it's a similar philosophy, but once they come in, we make sure in the first 90 days they have at least one in-person connection.
Do you think 90 days is the right number?
It probably should be like first 10 days or first 30 days, and realistically. And most, I think 90 days is our lose. Like if it's not happened in 90, we've got an issue. Most people, I think, in the first month, like my second week, I was on a plane.
Yeah.
So it just depends. But yeah, definitely make sure we don't lose sight of that.
Yeah, definitely. So I just want to shift shift gears here for a second and talk about data, which everyone I know loves talking about data. And on the workplace side, we obviously collect a fair amount of data, whether it's occupancy data, things like that. And then on the HR side, there's a fair amount of data as well that they are looking at in terms of, from an HR perspective. In your respective organizations and experience, do you see these data sets coming together for decision-making purposes? And I know in my experience, I've seen sometimes, the silos inhibit some of that collaboration to say, let's compare notes and figure out what our hiring strategy, location strategy, whatever that may be. So I'm just wondering, being that workplace has shifted back and forth between teams, right? What have we done with those data sets to kind of make a cohesive decision-making or strategy, essentially?
Adrian from the panel yesterday is ringing in my head. Correlation is not causation.
Right.
Because there is that temptation to correlate it, right? And say, well, we have a ton of badge data. If someone's on site, are they more engaged? And saying, okay, well, that could be why they're more engaged. And I think you run the risk and you run the danger of people pulling what they want out of the correlation versus it actually being a causation. And that's where you really have to get in to the qualitative and understanding what does make someone feel connected to the company. Is that being on site? Is that having a friend? Is that the food, which is strange to me, but for some people it is. And yeah, so I'm very careful with data and taking correlation reports between HR and workplace and making sure that those have a very small set of people that get to see them before we start pulling out facts from them.
But has there been decisions that have been made from looking at both sets of information?
Yes.
I would say yes. I mean, there have been decisions, but I think a different spin on this is, and maybe we touched on this briefly, but I think this is where I don't want to use the word true colors, or the real philosophy of being people first comes out in an organization at the leadership level. Like you can look at badge data, you can look at engagement data, you can look at all these different data sets. The end of the day, like what is going to drive your decision? Is it having flexibility with an employee experience despite your offices being half empty and that's a financial burden? Or is it it could be business driven, right? You're in a really bad financial situation and you do have to cut your costs, right? So I think the data sets all exist, but what really comes to light is what are you really trying to solve for? If it's people first and you have the financial flexibility to do that, you can put your money where your mouth is.
Data is
you're the
an
culprit.
input, not a decision maker.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we have tons of data, right? We have the badge data, network data, Zoom data, throughput of our, kitchen food lines, right? I mean, there's endless data sets, right? And I think some of that is really helpful. It can help refine the types of spaces that you build, or the kind of drive real estate sizing decisions and things like that. But the qualitative bit, to your point, I think is the most important part for us, at least. Like our first operating principle is users first at Stripe, and as a workplace organization, our users are primarily Stripe employees, right? And so really trying to get an understanding of what's working, what's not, what makes people want to come in an office. So we have on top of the Stripe satisfaction surveys, these Stripe sets where there's questions about workplace, and then we do a user feedback loop and do kind of actual in-person focus groups, right, of our core power users, right? And I think that's been super informative and really helped driven a lot of the programs that we layer on top of workplace. These connectivity weeks and other things we're doing are very much driven
By that data.
by that data, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just, I know is there something right now that irks you most about the roles you're doing that you're getting either pushback from leadership or some sort of frustrations that you can vent here in private to just a
In
couple of our
private.
close friends? Right? Are there things that you're struggling with? I'd love to hear some of those tensions that you might be dealing with,
Yeah.
and just to hear them out a little bit, because we're probably all having some of
Go
those.
I think for me it's like every 2 weeks it's like we need to be in person, because in person's better than remote and back and forth. Like I think both have pros and cons, and the balance is hard to strike at every given time. So there'll be teams who'll be like, we just want to be in person for the next 3-4 weeks because we need to get through it, and there's a way to balance that. So for me, it's just that pendulum keeps switching between, even internally with our own leadership team, that accountability and alignment that I referenced needs to be recalibrated almost feels like every month or every week sometimes, because it is real and it's hard to balance that out. So for me, it's just going back and forth on that.
Do you find it to just be a distraction?
No, I mean, I mean, maybe, yeah, a little bit of a distraction, I would say, in some ways, but I think it also almost every time peels a layer or two under behind what they're actually trying to solve for.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So a leader might be actually trying to solve for low performance by having someone in for 3 weeks.
Mhm.
So for me, it's distraction, well, in some ways, but it's also not, because 9 out of 10 times there's something deeper under it from a people perspective, and I'm able to get to that, which this is an avenue to do. So.
Right.
I'm so sick of the conversation still being come in, come in,
Yeah.
come in, come in. It's like, come on, we're working with multiple different ways that you can get work done now. You have physical, you have virtual, you have experiential. Use all of your tools. And I just see so many leaders saying, I just want to use the tool of in person, of that physical space. And I see so many individual contributors saying, I just want to use virtual. I'm refusing to see the other tools that are out there. And it's driving me crazy. But I think that we're changing an industry. It was the societal norm to work in person for decades. And so changing that story is going to take a while.
True. I think for me, one thing that's been challenging, and it kind of goes back to the comms bit, but just sort of the messaging from the top has not always been consistent along the way, right? And it's just a surprise, surprise. But I mean, of our senior leadership team, I think it's actually, being totally honest, I think it's fairly split 50-50 between people that want to be basically like fully remote. You don't need to come in the office, and then some that are be in every day. I think there's some of the founders would probably want you to be there 80 hours a week, right? And it's just their own personal opinions or their what they think works. And I think there is some underlying component to, is this a performance related thing they're trying to solve for, right? Like sales teams want all their salespeople in all the time, and they want to see them and make sure they're doing their job, I guess. But I think that we're doing a much better job of that now, but definitely had some missteps in the beginning about communicating the why and sort of even just sending a clear message of what the expectation is, I think, right? So that's been really messy. And on the workplace side, we get nailed for that, right? They're like, why is workplace making me come back and do this thing? I'm like, well, it's not. We're supporting
It's
the
always my
policy.
favorite. How many of you have gotten blamed?
And it's
for
like,
this?
well,
Why is workplace
why can't
making me
workplace
come
make
in?
us happier? And like, well, we're not.
Yeah.
That goes back to
Not that happy.
comms and kind of clear roles and responsibilities, which are tough. So just like I touched on before, I think over COVID we've all had to become a little bit like psychologists and really have a much deeper understanding of human behavior and empathy. Just a little bit of a personal question. How have you found your experience? How have you found that it actually impacted you as a person, having to kind of be on the forefront of understanding those teams and driving policy, right? We've had to think about that a little bit. I'm just wondering, how have you found that as that personal journey, Sarah?
Yeah, I just think the expectation on workplace people has been exhausting. And you know, I'm grateful for WorkSpaces because we all get to come here and kind of blow off some steam.
Oh, and we blew off some
Oh
steam.
yeah, we blew off some steam.
I agree.
Thank you for letting me karaoke 4 songs. Um, but yeah, it's been exhausting, and but I also think that it's been such a freaking cool opportunity for all of us to be able to dive in so much deeper than I don't know if any of you remember, but the expectation 15 years ago or so was we manage buildings.
Yeah.
It was always
Yeah.
such a stupid expectation, right? But
Can't they just manage themselves?
right. But now the expectation is that we manage people, and that's a whole hell of a lot harder of a thing to manage, but a more interesting role as well, but exhausting at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I second that fully. I think it's been a bit of a shift to, you know, he's kind of said like a psychologist role. I think just trying to be a lot more empathetic about everyone. You know, everyone's coming at this from their own personal perspective, right? And trying and different skill sets and backgrounds, right? And it was previously,
different situations.
yeah, very
Right.
different life situations and just like what motivates them to come in and be themselves, I guess. But I think so trying to be really, really thoughtful about that has been huge. And I think that's also driven decisions around design of workspace and things like that. But just in general, I think being much more thoughtful and aware, I guess, than even before has been huge. And just recognizing that everyone has a different background, I guess, right? And what they're, I think for us, this big shift. I was joking about being event promoters earlier, but like so much of what we do now is less about operating buildings, to your point, and much more about the experiential component of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And most of these folks, especially on the front lines, were not hired to do that. They were hired to run the janitorial and make sure that the food lines were hot. You know, like that's a very different skill set. So yeah.
Right. You have
I would second both their comments, and I think just really continuing to focus on different personas for whatever you build. So I remember when we were building our flexible workplace at Airbnb, you know, I got a message from someone, I think that day or two after we rolled it out, saying, I can't work from home. I don't have the right physical workspace at home. I've got like a lot of kids running, whatever the situation may be. And it reminded me that, you know, as we're promoting remote work, there are individuals that need to and want to be in the office too, and they may not have the best sustainable condition for whatever reasons. So always thinking through, like, there's no one size fits all. I think that's become even more clear in our jobs in the last few years, because people are different, circumstances are different, needs are different, and they change. So just when you think you figured it out, it's going to change.
And I think our next challenge is actually going to be equity.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have the people that do come into the office because they have to.
Yep.
And are there going to be different opportunities that they get? Because there
Proximity
is still a
bias, yeah.
proximity bias. It's
Yeah.
very real.
Mm-hmm.
And so honestly, I think that's the next thing to hit us in 2024 from a workplace standpoint.
Yeah.
Wow, this has been a really wonderful conversation. David, Sarah, Q, and John, can we give them a big round of applause? Thank you.